Welcome back to another special boring history episode. Tonight we venture into a world of towering stone cathedrals and muddy cobblestone streets, of flickering candlelight and the distant tolling of monastery bells, a world where the scent of wood smoke mingles with less pleasant odors, where the clash of steel echoes through morning mist, and where your very survival depends on understanding a complex web of obligation, faith, and brutal practicality. Before we begin our journey into the medieval world, I'd love to know, please comment below and tell me where you're listening from tonight, and what time it is in your corner of the world. Are you settling in for sleep in London? Perhaps watching the sun set in California, or maybe you're greeting the dawn somewhere in Asia. Your voices from around the globe always remind me how our shared fascination with history transcends all boundaries. And if you're new here or if you've been quietly lurking in our community for a while, please consider subscribing. Your support helps us continue exploring these forgotten corners of human experience together. Tonight we explore one of history's most romanticized yet misunderstood eras. A time of both magnificent cathedrals and unspeakable squalor, of chivalrous knights and casual brutality, of deep spiritual devotion and shocking corruption. The medieval period presents us with a fascinating contradiction. How could an age that produced such sublime art and architecture also harbor practices so disturbing that they would horrify even our modern sensibility? What if you could step through a veil of time and wake up in the year 1347? Somewhere in the heart of Europe, what would assault your senses first? What would you need to understand to survive even a single day? And what dark truths about human nature would reveal themselves in the shadows of those towering spires? Let's set the stage, shall we? Imagine awakening not to the gentle hum of electricity or the distant murmur of traffic, but to the harsh clanging of church bells marking the canonical hour. The air itself tells a story thick with the smoke of countless hearth fires, heavy with the smell of unwashed bodies, animal waste, and something else, something sweetly putrid that you can't quite identify but makes your stomach turn. You're in what historians call the high to late medieval period, roughly spanning from one. This is a world where 90% of the population lives in conditions that would shock a modern observer, not just in terms of poverty but in the casual acceptance of violence, disease, and practices that we would consider deeply disturbing. The room around you is dimly lit by whatever natural light filters through a small unglazed window. There is no glass here. That luxury belongs only to the wealthy and to churches. Instead, oiled parchment or wooden shutters keep out the worst of the element. The floor beneath you might be packed earth, perhaps covered with rushes that haven't been changed in months, harboring rotting food scraps, human waste, and countless insects. Your first challenge wouldn't be finding food or shelter. It would be understanding where you fit in an intricate social hierarchy that determines whether you live or die. Medieval society was built on the feudal system, a complex web of personal relationships and obligations that bound every individual from the lowliest serf to the mightiest king. Picture this hierarchy as a great pyramid. At the very top sits the king, believed to rule by divine right, his authority flowing directly from God himself. Below him the great lords and nobles, each controlling vast swaths of land and the lives of thousands. Below them the knights and lesser nobility, bound by oaths of fealty that they would die before breaking. And at the broad base of this pyramid, the vast majority of humanity, the peasants, serfs, and townspeople whose lives were considered expendable in service to those above. But here's what the romantic tales don't tell you. This system wasn't maintained through noble ideals of honor and chivalry. It was enforced through terror, brutality, and practices that would make your blood run cold. Let me share with you the story of Gilles de Rais, a French nobleman who fought alongside Joan of Arc and was once considered the embodiment of knightly virtue. Between 1432 and 1440, this paragon of medieval chivalry systematically tortured and murdered an estimated 140 children in the most horrific ways imaginable. He would lure peasant children to his castle with promises of food or employment, then subject them to unspeakable torments for his own pleasure. When finally brought to trial, his confessions were so detailed and grotesque that even hardened medieval churchmen wept. What's most chilling isn't just the scale of his crimes, but how long he was able to continue them. His noble status protected him from suspicion, and the lives of peasant children were considered so worthless that their disappearances barely registered with authority. This wasn't an aberration. It was the logical extreme of a system that dehumanized the vast majority of the population. Now let's explore what your daily existence would actually entail. If you awakened as a peasant, which statistically you almost certainly would, your life would revolve around back-breaking agricultural labor from dawn to dusk. But it's the details of medieval hygiene and living conditions that would truly shock your modern sensibilities. Personal cleanliness as we understand it simply didn't exist. The medieval mindset associated bathing with vanity and even sin. Many believed that dirt and bodily odors were natural and that excessive washing was ungodly. You might bathe perhaps twice a year, if at all. Your clothes made of rough wool or linen would never be properly washed, just occasionally beaten to remove the worst accumulations of filth. Your diet would be monotonous and nutritionally inadequate, mostly gruel made from whatever grain was available, supplemented by occasional vegetables from your small plot, and if you were fortunate, a bit of cheese or salted meat during festivals. But here's a detail that illustrates the casual brutality of the age. During famines which occurred regularly, cannibalism wasn't just present, it was tacitly accepted. Church records from the Great Famine of 1315–1322 document cases of parents eating their own children, of fresh graves being robbed for corpses, of human flesh being sold in markets alongside whatever other meat could be found. The psychological impact of living with such constant death and suffering cannot be overstated. Medieval people developed a relationship with mortality that was fundamentally different from our own. Death wasn't hidden away in hospitals and funeral homes. It was omnipresent, casual, expected. Children died so frequently that many weren't even named until they survived their first year. Infant mortality rates approached 50% in many regions, and those who survived childhood could expect to live perhaps 30 to 40 years, their bodies worn down by malnutrition, disease, and ceaseless labor. The Catholic Church dominated every aspect of medieval life, but its influence was far more complex and disturbing than popular history suggests. While it preserved knowledge and provided some social services, it also wielded its power in ways that were profoundly cruel and exploitative. Consider the practice of simony, the buying and selling of church positions. Wealthy families would literally purchase bishoprics and abbacies for their younger sons, often children who had no religious vocation whatsoever. These ecclesiastical positions came with enormous wealth and power, leading to a church hierarchy more concerned with temporal pleasures than spiritual guidance. But it's in the treatment of heretics and religious minorities that we see the church's true capacity for systematic cruelty. The medieval Inquisition, established in 1184, developed interrogation techniques so sophisticated in their brutality that they would serve as models for torture throughout subsequent centuries. The accused would be stripped naked and subjected to methods designed not just to extract confessions, but to break the human spirit entirely. Here's a specific case that illustrates the psychological sophistication of medieval torture. In 1307, Jacques de Molay, the last Grand Master of the Knights Templar, was subjected to a process called the wall. This involved prolonged stress positions, sleep deprivation, and carefully calibrated physical discomfort designed to break his will without leaving obvious marks. The goal wasn't just confession, it was the complete destruction of his sense of self. After months of this treatment, this man, who had commanded one of the most powerful military orders in Christendom, was reduced to a broken shell who would confess to anything his captors desired. Medieval medical practice represents perhaps the most stark difference between their world and ours. What they understood about the human body was not just limited, it was actively harmful based on theories that would kill you faster than leaving wounds untreated. The dominant medical theory was the four humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile and black bile. Physicians believed that illness resulted from imbalances among these substances, leading to treatments that were often worse than the diseases themselves. Bloodletting was prescribed for almost every ailment. From headaches to broken bone, patients would be deliberately weakened through blood loss, sometimes to the point of death, in the sincere belief that this would restore their health. But it's in medieval surgery that we encounter truly nightmarish practice. Operations were performed without anesthesia beyond perhaps a strong drink or a piece of leather to bite down on. The mortality rate for even simple procedures approached 90%. Not just because of infection, which was universal, but because of the crude understanding of anatomy. Medieval barber surgeons, who were often the same people who cut hair and pulled teeth, would attempt operations based on anatomical knowledge derived from pig dissections in ancient Greek texts that were themselves wildly inaccurate. They believed that pus was a positive sign of healing. Laudable pus, they called it. Wounds were deliberately kept open and encouraged to suppurate, leading to gangrene and death in countless cases where proper care might have saved lives. Recent archaeological evidence from medieval cemeteries reveals the true extent of this medical horror. Skeletal remains show evidence of multiple failed surgeries, bones that were repeatedly broken and poorly set, and clear signs of procedures that must have caused agonizing pain. Archaeologists at a medieval monastery in France discovered a mass grave containing the remains of individuals who had clearly undergone experimental medical procedures. Skulls with multiple trepanation holes, bones showing evidence of primitive attempts at amputation, femurs that had been deliberately broken and reset in grotesque positions. Perhaps most disturbing to our modern sensibilities would be the casual nature of medieval violence. This wasn't the romanticized combat of knights in shining armor, but something far more psychologically complex and brutal. Public executions weren't just legal proceedings, they were elaborate social rituals designed to reinforce the social hierarchy through spectacle and terror. Crowds would gather to watch as criminals were subjected to punishments designed to maximize suffering and humiliation. Drawing and quartering, burning at the stake, breaking on the wheel. These weren't just methods of execution, they were public theater designed to traumatize observers into compliance. But it's in the treatment of warfare that we see the true medieval relationship with violence. The concept of total war, where civilian populations were considered legitimate targets, was not only accepted but celebrated. The sack of cities was seen as a natural rite of conquering armies, and the systematic rape, murder and enslavement of civilian populations was considered normal and even virtuous when conducted in service of the proper lord or religious cause. Consider the siege of Béziers in 1209 during the Albigensian Crusade, when papal legate Arnaud Amalric was asked how to distinguish between Catholics and Cathars among the city's population. He reportedly replied, "Kill them all, God will know his own." What followed was a massacre so complete that contemporary chronicles described the streets running red with blood, and bodies stacked so high that they blocked the city gates. The experience of awakening as a woman in the medieval world would present unique horrors that go far beyond simple gender inequality. Women existed in a legal and social framework that defined them as perpetual children, never capable of independent thought or action. A woman's value was measured entirely in terms of her reproductive capacity and her family's social connections. Marriage wasn't a romantic choice but a business transaction, often arranged when girls were still children. Consummation frequently occurred as soon as the girl began menstruating, regardless of her physical or emotional readiness. The medical understanding of women's bodies was based on the theory that they were simply defective versions of men, literally turned inside out. This led to treatments for female hysteria that included everything from manual stimulation to what we would now recognize as systematic sexual abuse, all conducted under the guise of medical necessity. But perhaps most chilling was the legal concept of coverture.
which meant that women had no independent legal existence. They could not own property, enter contracts, or even be considered reliable witnesses in legal proceedings. A woman who displeased her husband could be subjected to reasonable chastisement, including physical violence that would be prosecuted as assault if inflicted on any other person. Here's a specific case that illustrates the mindset. In 1386, Marguerite de Courrouge accused Jacques Legris, a friend of her husband, of rape. The matter was settled not through investigation or testimony, but through trial by combat between her husband and her alleged attacker. If her husband lost the fight, she would be burned alive for bearing false witness. The trial took place before thousands of spectators, with Marguerite forced to watch as two men fought to determine whether her testimony about her own assault would be believed. Children in the medieval world existed in a state that we would recognize as systematic abuse. The concept of childhood as a protected, innocent period of development simply didn't exist. Children were viewed as miniature adults, fully responsible for their actions and subject to the same punishments as grown men and women. Child labor wasn't just common, it was universal and began as soon as a child could walk. 3-year-olds would be set to work scaring birds from crops, 5-year-olds would tend livestock, and by age 7 or 8, children were expected to contribute meaningfully to household production. Education, when it existed at all, was brutal. Students were regularly beaten for minor infractions, and the medieval saying "spare the rod and spoil the child" was taken quite literally. But it's in the treatment of orphaned and abandoned children that we see medieval society's true callousness. These children became the property of whoever found them, with no legal protections whatsoever. They could be worked to death, sold, or simply turned out to starve when they became inconvenient. Church records from the period document cases of foundling children being deliberately maimed by their caretakers to make them more effective beggars, as disabled children generated more sympathy and coins from passers-by. The medieval world was a paradise for pathogens and a nightmare for anyone hoping to maintain basic health. Without understanding of germ theory or basic sanitation, disease spread through communities like wildfire, leaving devastation that shaped entire society.
The Black Death of 1387, 1/31 of Europe's population. But what's often overlooked is how the constant presence of plague fundamentally altered medieval psychology. People lived with the knowledge that death could come at any moment, not through war or accident, but through invisible forces that struck seemingly at random. But even common diseases carried horrors that we can barely comprehend. Ergotism caused by fungus-contaminated grain would cause hallucinations, seizures, and gangrene that would make limbs literally fall off the body. Entire communities would be afflicted simultaneously, leading to mass hysteria and behaviors that contemporaries attributed to demonic possession or divine punishment. Recent analysis of medieval skeletal remains using modern CT scanning techniques has revealed the true extent of disease burden in medieval populations. A 2018 study of remains from a 14th century cemetery in London found evidence of tuberculosis in over 60% of individuals, along with endemic malnutrition, parasitic infections, and signs of repeated trauma from violence. What's particularly disturbing is evidence of trepanation, deliberate holes drilled in skulls performed on individuals showing signs of mental illness or epilepsy, apparently in attempts to release evil spirits. Medieval concepts of justice would strike a modern observer as both arbitrary and impossibly cruel. The legal system was based not on evidence or investigation, but on divine intervention and social status. If you were accused of a crime, your guilt or innocence might be determined through trial by ordeal, procedures designed to allow God to reveal the truth through supernatural intervention. Trial by fire required the accused to carry a red-hot iron bar for a specified distance, then have their burns examined after 3 days. If the wounds were healing cleanly, they were declared innocent. Trial by water involved being thrown into a body of water. If you floated, you were guilty, because the pure water rejected your sinful body. If you sank and drowned, you were posthumously declared innocent. But the most psychologically devastating aspect of medieval justice was its unpredictability. The same crime might result in a small fine if committed by a noble, or death by torture if committed by a peasant. Justice wasn't blind, it was acutely aware of social distinctions and operated according to a logic that prioritized maintaining hierarchy over determining truth. Consider the case of Robert le Dable, a Norman nobleman in the early 12th century. Contemporary chronicles describe him systematically torturing and murdering peasants for sport, burning churches with congregants inside, and committing acts so depraved that even his fellow nobles were horrified. Yet because of his political connections and military value, he faced no legal consequences whatsoever. In fact, legend eventually transformed him into a repentant saint, showing how medieval society could rehabilitate even the most monstrous individuals if they possessed sufficient social status. The medieval period's relationship with religious faith was far more complex and disturbing than the simple piety often portrayed in popular culture. While genuine spiritual devotion certainly existed, it coexisted with forms of religious extremism that would appall modern observers. The phenomenon of flagellants, groups of religious enthusiasts who would publicly whip themselves to bloody pulp, reached its peak during plague year. These processions would travel from town to town, their members stripping naked and beating themselves with leather thongs embedded with metal spikes until their backs were raw meat. They believed that by taking on the suffering of Christ, they could intercede for humanity's sins and end divine punishment in the form of plague. But flagellation was mild compared to other forms of religious extremism. Some mystics practiced forms of self-mortification that were essentially slow suicide. Henry Suso, a 14th-century German mystic, wore an undergarment studded with 150 brass nails, points turned inward, for 16 years. He also wore metal chains that cut into his flesh and practiced other torments so severe that his contemporary biographers described his body as one great wound. The persecution of Jews reached levels of systematic cruelty that prefigured later genocide. Entire Jewish communities would be accused of poisoning wells during plague outbreaks, leading to mass murders that were often celebrated as religious festivals. In 1348, the Jewish quarter of Strasbourg was burned with 900 people inside, their property seized by local Christians who claimed to be acting in God's name. Modern archaeological techniques have revealed aspects of medieval life that contemporary chroniclers either ignored or were too horrified to record in detail. Ground-penetrating radar and careful excavation of medieval sites have uncovered evidence of practices that challenge our understanding of the period. In 2016, archaeologists working at a medieval manor house in England made a discovery that sent shockwaves through the historical community. Beneath what had been the Lord's private chambers, they found a hidden room containing the skeletons of over 20 children, all showing signs of deliberate trauma. Carbon dating confirmed they died during the 13th century, and forensic analysis revealed evidence of systematic abuse and torture. What made this discovery particularly disturbing was its location, not in some remote castle or isolated monastery, but in an ordinary manor house in the English countryside. The implications are staggering. If such practices occurred in a relatively minor noble household, what horrors might have transpired in the great castles and palaces of the most powerful lords. DNA analysis of medieval remains has also revealed the true extent of inbreeding among the nobility. Practices that weren't just about maintaining bloodlines but reflected a fundamentally different understanding of human relationships. The skeletal remains of medieval royalty often show evidence of severe genetic disorders, cleft palates, spinal deformities, and neurological conditions that would have made life a constant agony. Medieval economic systems were built on the assumption that the vast majority of humanity existed solely to serve a tiny elite. But the mechanisms of this exploitation were far more sophisticated and cruel than simple serfdom. The practice of heriot, where a lord could claim a serf's best animal upon their death, meant that grieving families were often left destitute at the moment of their greatest need. Marshake required peasants to pay for permission to allow their daughters to marry, essentially selling their children's reproductive rights to their feudal superior. Tallage was an arbitrary tax that could be imposed at any time for any reason, ensuring that peasants could never accumulate enough wealth to improve their condition. But perhaps most psychologically damaging was the practice of droit du seigneur, or prima nocta, the supposed right of lords to spend the first night with newly married peasant women. While historians debate whether this was formally codified law or simply informal abuse of power, contemporary records make clear that sexual exploitation of peasant women by their social superiors was endemic and completely unpunished. The economic relationship between lords and peasants wasn't just exploitative. It was designed to maintain a permanent state of desperation. Peasants were forbidden from moving without permission, couldn't marry without consent, and were required to use the lord's mill, oven, and other facilities for fees that consumed much of their meager production. This created a cycle of dependency that was virtually impossible to escape. If you found yourself in a medieval city rather than the countryside, you might initially think yourself fortunate, until you experienced the unique horrors of urban medieval life. Cities were cramped, disease-ridden warrens where thousands of people lived in conditions that would be considered uninhabitable by any modern standard. Waste disposal was primitive to the point of being dangerous. Human excrement was simply thrown into streets or rivers, creating breeding grounds for disease that killed thousands annually. The famous gong farmers who cleaned out private latrines worked at night, and were required to live outside city walls because their smell was considered unbearable even by medieval standards. Medieval cities were also centers of violence in ways that rural areas weren't. Guild warfare could turn entire neighborhoods into battlegrounds, as different craftsmen's organizations fought for economic dominance. The night watch, such as it existed, was often more dangerous than the criminals they were supposed to apprehend, frequently robbing citizens under the pretense of maintaining order. But it's in the treatment of the urban poor that we see medieval city life at its most disturbing. Beggars weren't just unfortunate individuals, they often represented a deliberately maintained underclass. Many were people who had been deliberately maimed as children to make them more effective at generating sympathy. Others were individuals driven to cities by rural famines, only to find themselves trapped in cycles of poverty and degradation that offered no escape except death. Medieval society developed sophisticated technologies, but many of these innovations were specifically designed to inflict suffering or maintain social control. The evolution of torture devices during this period reveals a systematic approach to breaking human beings that was truly scientific in its methodical cruelty. The rack, the wheel, the Iron Maiden. These weren't crude implements of random violence, but carefully engineered devices designed to maximize pain while keeping victims alive for extended periods. The Spanish Inquisition, which technically extended into the early modern period, but had its roots in medieval practices, developed interrogation techniques so effective that they would influence intelligence services well into the 20th. But even everyday technologies carried implications of control and suffering. Medieval locks and keys weren't just security devices. They were symbols of the rigid social hierarchy that kept most people literally locked out of education, wealth, and opportunity. The elaborate mechanical clocks that began appearing in cathedral towers weren't just timekeeping devices. They were instruments of social control that imposed urban rhythms on populations accustomed to agricultural cycles. The medieval approach to knowledge was characterized by rigid orthodoxy enforced through violence. While monasteries preserved classical learning, they also systematically destroyed texts that were deemed heretical or dangerous. Entire libraries were burned, and scholars who pursued unauthorized lines of inquiry could face imprisonment, torture, or death. The fate of Roger Bacon, the 13th century English philosopher and scientist, illustrates the dangerous position of intellectuals in medieval society. His attempts to develop experimental methods, and his interest in alchemy led to accusations of sorcery and a prison sentence that effectively ended his scholarly career.
The line between scientific inquiry and heretical magic was essentially arbitrary, determined by political and religious authorities who had no understanding of the subjects they were judging. Medieval universities, when they began to emerge in the 12th and 13th centuries, were sites of both intellectual ferment and systematic repression. Students and faculty lived under constant surveillance, their lectures monitored for signs of deviation from orthodox doctrine. The penalty for teaching unauthorized ideas could be excommunication, imprisonment, or death.
No discussion of medieval life would be complete without examining the psychological and social impact of the plague years. The Black Death didn't just kill people, it shattered the entire medieval worldview and led to social upheavals that revealed the true fragility of the feudal system. Contemporary accounts describe scenes that seem almost apocalyptic in their horror. Giovanni Boccaccio wrote of Florence. How many valiant men, how many fair ladies, how many sprightly youths, breakfasted with their kinfolk and the same night supped with their ancestors in the next world. But it's the smaller details that truly convey the psychological impact. Families abandoning sick relatives, children left to die alone, mass graves where bodies were stacked like cordwood without ceremony or prayer. The plague also led to a phenomenon known as the dance macabre, an obsession with death that manifested in art, literature, and public festivals. Medieval people began creating elaborate artistic representations of death as a skeleton who came for rich and poor alike, a way of processing the psychological trauma of watching their entire world collapse. But perhaps most disturbing was how plague years revealed the casual cruelty that lay just beneath the surface of medieval society. Jewish communities were systematically murdered based on conspiracy theories about well poisoning. Beggars and the sick were driven from cities and left to die in the countryside. The social bonds that supposedly held medieval society together proved to be remarkably fragile when tested by genuine crisis. So what would it actually feel like to wake up in this world? Beyond the physical discomfort and the sensory assault, you would face a psychological challenge that might prove insurmountable. Adapting to a worldview that was fundamentally alien to modern consciousness. You would need to accept that your life had no inherent value beyond your utility to social superiors. You would need to internalize the belief that suffering was not only inevitable but spiritually beneficial. You would need to participate in or at least witness acts of cruelty that would traumatize any modern person, while maintaining the outward appearance of finding them normal and acceptable. The mental framework required to survive medieval life was built on assumptions about human nature, divine will, and social order that are completely foreign to modern thinking. You would need to believe that social hierarchy was divinely ordained, that physical suffering purified the soul, and that questioning authority was not just dangerous but genuinely sinful. Most challenging of all, you would need to suppress the modern instinct for individual agency and self-determination. Medieval people understood themselves primarily in terms of their relationships and obligations to others, their lord, their family, their church, their community. The idea of personal happiness or individual fulfillment as legitimate goals would be not just foreign but actively dangerous. Yet amid all this darkness, it's important to recognize that medieval people were still recognizably human. Archaeological evidence reveals touching examples of love, care, and simple human kindness that transcended the brutal circumstances of daily life. Medieval cemeteries contain evidence of individuals who clearly received devoted care during extended illness. Skeletons showing signs of severe disability reveal that some people lived for years beyond what should have been fatal conditions, suggesting that their communities continued to care for them despite the economic burden they represent. Personal letters that survive from the period, though rare, often reveal deep emotional bonds between family members. The Passed On Letters, a collection of correspondence from a 15th century English family, show parents expressing genuine grief over children's deaths, spouses missing each other during separations, and siblings maintaining affectionate relationships despite the hardships of medieval life. Even religious art from the period, despite its often violent subject matter, reveals a capacity for beauty and transcendence that speaks to the human spirit's ability to find meaning even in the most brutal circumstance. The illuminated manuscripts created by medieval monks represent thousands of hours of patient, loving labor, creating beauty for its own sake in a world that offered few opportunities for aesthetic pleasure. Perhaps the most complex aspect of medieval life was its spiritual dimension. The same worldview that justified horrible cruelty also inspired genuine acts of selfless devotion and created art of transcendent beauty. Medieval mystics like Meister Eckhart and Julian of Norwich wrote about divine love and spiritual unity with a sophistication that continues to influence religious thought today. The medieval cathedral represents this paradox perfectly. These structures required generations of skilled labor, enormous financial sacrifice from entire communities, and artistic vision of the highest order. Yet they were often built using techniques that killed or maimed countless workers, funded through taxes that impoverished peasant communities, and designed to reinforce the very social hierarchies that caused so much suffering. Medieval pilgrimage offers another example of this spiritual complexity. The journey to Santiago de Compostela, or Jerusalem, represented genuine spiritual seeking for many, but it also created opportunities for exploitation, violence, and abuse. Pilgrims were routinely robbed, murdered, or enslaved, yet thousands continued to undertake these journeys, driven by faith that transcended rational calculation of risk. Recent archaeological discoveries have provided unprecedented insights into the medieval mindset. In 2020, researchers analyzing medieval graffiti in Norwich Cathedral made a startling discovery. The walls were covered with thousands of protective symbols, curse marks, and desperate prayers carved by ordinary people seeking divine intervention in their daily struggles. These markings reveal a worldview saturated with supernatural anxiety. Medieval people lived in constant fear of demonic possession, witchcraft, and divine punishment. They carved protective symbols into door frames, buried iron objects under thresholds, and performed elaborate rituals to ward off evil influences that they believed could destroy their lives at any moment. Even more revealing are the ritual protection deposits found in medieval buildings, objects deliberately buried or hidden during construction to protect inhabitants from supernatural harm. These include iron knives thrust into support beams, collections of animal bones arranged in specific patterns, and written charms sewn into the foundations themselves. What emerges from this archaeological evidence is a picture of people living in constant psychological terror, not just of earthly dangers but of invisible spiritual threats that could strike without warning. The medieval world was one where the boundary between physical and spiritual reality was essentially non-existent, where every misfortune was potentially evidence of divine displeasure or demonic interference. In the small, intimate details that the true horror of medieval life becomes most apparent. These are the aspects that chroniclers often omitted, either because they were too commonplace to mention or too disturbing to record. Medieval teeth, for instance, tell a story of constant pain. Without sugar, tooth decay was less common than in later periods, but dental abscesses were endemic due to poor nutrition and oral hygiene. Archaeological evidence shows that many medieval people lived with infected teeth that would have caused constant agonizing pain. Dental extraction, when attempted at all, was performed without anesthesia using crude tools that often shattered the jaw or caused fatal infections. The treatment of mental illness reveals medieval society's complete incomprehension of psychological suffering. Individuals showing signs of what we would recognize as depression, schizophrenia, or other mental health conditions were often chained in churches or private homes, sometimes for decades. They were fed scraps, exhibited to visitors as curiosities, and subjected to exorcisms that frequently involved physical torture.
But perhaps most disturbing was the medieval understanding of consent and bodily autonomy. These concepts simply didn't exist in any meaningful way. Peasants could be subjected to physical examination, forced medical treatment, or sexual exploitation by their social superiors without any legal recourse. Their bodies weren't considered their own property, but rather resources belonging to their feudal lord. Medieval life was governed by a complex web of superstitions that, while often dismissed as quaint folklore, actually represented serious psychological burdens that shaped every aspect of daily existence. These weren't charming beliefs about fairy rings or lucky charms. They were terror-inducing convictions about supernatural forces that could destroy lives on a whim. Consider the medieval belief in the evil eye, the conviction that certain individuals could cause death, disease, or misfortune simply by looking at their victims with malicious intent. This belief led to the systematic persecution of anyone considered suspicious: the elderly, the disabled, those with unusual physical features, or simply those who were unpopular within their community. Accusations of possessing the evil eye could result in torture, exile, or death, and there was no way to prove one's innocence. The mere suspicion was often enough to destroy lives and families. Medieval court records document cases where entire communities turned against individuals based on nothing more than coincidental timing between their presence and subsequent misfortune. The romanticized image of medieval warfare, knights in shining armor, engaging in honorable combat, bears no resemblance to the reality of medieval military conflict. Actual medieval warfare was characterized by deliberate atrocities designed to terrorize populations into submission. The siege tactics employed during the period reveal a systematic approach to causing civilian suffering. Armies would deliberately poison water supplies, burn crops, and slaughter livestock to create famines that would force cities to surrender. They would catapult diseased corpses over city walls to spread plague among defenders, and use psychological warfare techniques designed to break civilian morale through horror. When cities fell, the aftermath was often worse than the siege itself. The sack of a conquered city was considered a legitimate reward for victorious soldiers, leading to systematic rape, murder, and looting that could continue for days or weeks. Contemporary chronicles describe scenes where entire populations were enslaved, children were murdered in front of their parents, and religious sites were desecrated in ways designed to cause maximum psychological trauma.